Ever wonder what people really sounded like in the Old West? It wasn't all howdy partner and yeehaw. In fact, some of the slang tossed around in dusty saloons and frontier towns was downright bizarre. From insults that would confuse a modern cowboy to quirky phrases that made perfect sense only on the 1800s frontier. These words give us a hilarious glimpse into how folks actually talked back then. So saddle up and get ready to laugh. Here are 10 hilariously strange slang terms that were all the rage in the American Old West.
Like every era and social group, the Old West had its own unique language, a colorful vocabulary shaped by the people who lived there. Many settlers, cowhands, prospectors, and pioneers were far from polished in their speech. Most came from humble backgrounds and spoke in a direct, practical way that reflected their rugged surroundings and day-to-day challenges. Even those who struck it rich in gold fields, built successful ranches, or claimed vast stretches of land often lacked the refined manners and polished speech common in the cities of the East Coast. Instead, they spoke plainly, blending regional dialects, folk expressions, and frontier-born phrases into a language that was as untamed as the land itself. Because of this, slang wasn't just casual talk, it was part of daily life. These expressions captured the humor, hardships, and attitudes of people living on the edge of civilization. And contrary to what younger generations might think today, slang is nothing new. It's been part of human conversation for centuries, and the American frontier was no exception. So let's explore some of the most entertaining and peculiar slang terms that echoed through saloons, ranches, and mining camps across the Wild West. After reading them, try slipping a few into your everyday conversations. You might just start a new trend among your friends and family. High-falutin. On the frontier, people valued humility and hard work far more than social status or wealth. Anyone who acted as though they were better than the folks around them quickly earned a reputation, and not a flattering one. After all, the Old West wasn't a place for fancy banquets or exclusive clubs. It was a land built by people who endured hardship, relied on one another, and respected those who pulled their weight. So when someone showed up acting self-important or overly refined, locals often responded with humor and plain-spoken honesty. That's how the term highfalutin became part of frontier vocabulary. In essence, calling someone highfalutin meant they were putting on airs, behaving pompously, acting more sophisticated than they really were, or trying to appear above their surroundings. While some language historians have suggested a possible link to the Dutch word verluten, meaning stilted, this connection is unproven and likely just a bit of linguistic folklore. The true origin of the phrase remains uncertain. So if a friend starts acting a little too self-important or carries themselves with unwarranted grandeur, you can always bring them gently back to reality by calling them highfalutin, just as the cowhands and settlers of the Old West once did. Backdoor trots. Life on the frontier didn't always offer the luxury of proper meals. Settlers, cowhands, and travelers often had to make do with whatever food they could gather, trade, or prepare with limited resources. On good days, there might be enough supplies to cook a satisfying meal to share with companions around the campfire. But more often than not, meals were simple, improvised, and far from gourmet. Sometimes that meant roasting a small animal caught on the trail, boiling whatever was available, or simply relying on a cup of strong, bitter coffee to keep weary travelers awake after a cold night under the stars. These unpredictable diets, paired with questionable water sources and inconsistent food quality, frequently led to digestive issues that were simply accepted as part of life on the range. One particularly common experience even earned its own colorful name, the backdoor trots. It was a humorous way of describing what happened when a person suddenly had to hurry off to relieve themselves after a less than ideal meal. The phrase reflected the candid, unfiltered nature of frontier speech, a way to laugh at an unpleasant but unavoidable reality. While it might sound crude to modern ears, slang like this offers a surprisingly honest glimpse into daily life on the American frontier. It shows that people of the Old West met hardship, even the most uncomfortable parts, with a mix of practicality and humor. 4. Flusher. Anyone familiar with poker knows that holding 5 cards of the same suit is called a flush, a strong hand that often wins the round. And if you're lucky enough to hold a royal flush, you've hit the pinnacle of poker success. But what happens if you're just 1 card short with only 4 in the same suit? In that case, your hand is worth very little. On the 19th century frontier, gamblers had a special term for that situation: 4 flusher. Originally, it described a player who tried to bluff their way through a game, pretending to have a winning hand when, in truth, they had nothing at all. As time passed, the term evolved beyond the card table and found a broader meaning in everyday life. On the frontier, a 4 flusher became a label for anyone who exaggerated their abilities, made empty promises, or tried to impress others with false claims. It was a colorful way to describe someone who appeared confident and capable on the surface, but lacked substance underneath. This bit of Old West slang still feels surprisingly relevant today. After all, people who talk big but deliver little, the modern-day 4 flushers, are still around, just as they were on the frontier more than a century ago. Cattywampus. The word cattywampus has always caused a bit of confusion. Even in the Old West, there's no universal agreement on how to spell it, and you'll see several variations, from cattywampus to cattywampus. The pronunciation also differs depending on who's saying it. But no matter the spelling, its meaning has remained consistent. Something that's off balance, crooked, or simply not the way it should be. In frontier towns and across the expanding United States, people use cattywampus to describe anything that seemed out of place or askew. A crooked fence, a misaligned wagon wheel, or a plan that didn't go quite right, all could be called cattywampus. It was an everyday word for everyday problems. Linguists trace the term's first recorded use in America to the 1830s, originally appearing as an adverb, cattywampusly. As settlers moved westward, the word traveled with them, becoming a familiar part of frontier vocabulary. There's even a claim that Charles Dickens once used the term in Martin Chuzzlewit, but there's no solid evidence to support that. By the time that story was told, the word was already firmly established in American English. So the next time something looks crooked, misaligned, or just a little off, you can call it what 19th century pioneers did: cattywampus. However you choose to spell it, the meaning remains unmistakable. Prairie stuff. Life on the frontier revolved around the vast open prairies, and naturally many of the slang terms born in the Old West were inspired by that landscape. For cowboys, ranchers, and settlers, the prairie wasn't just scenery, it was their workplace, their home, and the backdrop of their daily existence. It's no surprise that their vocabulary reflected that reality. One common expression was prairie coal, also known as prairie pancakes. Despite the unappealing name, this term referred to dried cow manure, an essential resource on the frontier. In a land where wood was often scarce, settlers used dried manure as a practical and reliable fuel source, much like charcoal, to keep their campfires burning through the chilly nights. Another colorful phrase was prairie oysters. Far from seafood, this term described a frontier delicacy made from calf testicles, usually prepared by frying or roasting. Known today as Rocky Mountain oysters, the dish remains a curious and surprisingly popular part of Western culinary tradition. Then there was Prairie Dew, a poetic nickname for whiskey. This favorite drink among cowhands and pioneers was often shared around the fire after a long day's work, and the euphemism reflected both its importance and its ubiquity in frontier life. Finally, settlers came up with the term prairie tenor to describe the coyote. The name was a humorous nod to the animal's distinctive high-pitched howls that echoed across the plains, a kind of wild music that became part of the prairie's natural soundtrack. These expressions reveal not only the resourcefulness of people on the frontier, but also their creativity and humor. Even in the most rugged conditions, they found ways to describe their world with wit, practicality, and a deep connection to the land around them. California Widow. One of the most imaginative pieces of Old West slang was the term California Widow. During the westward expansion of the 19th century, countless men from the East Coast and the American South headed westward, hoping to transform their fortunes. Some sought opportunities in farming or cattle ranching, while others made the long journey all the way to California in search of gold and prosperity. In many cases, these men left their families, and especially their wives, behind, intending to send for them once they had established a stable life on the frontier. This situation gave rise to the term California Widow, which originally described a woman who was living apart from her husband even though the two were still legally married. Over time, the phrase evolved to refer more specifically to a woman whose husband had departed for the West, leaving her alone on the East Coast while he pursued success in distant territories. In essence, she was a widow not because of death, but because of the long separation caused by her husband's ambitions. For some couples, this separation ended with a reunion. Once the husband secured land, wealth, or opportunity, he might send for his wife to join him. For others, the distance became permanent, and the California widow was left to build a new life on her own. The phrase captures both the hope and the heartache that accompanied America's westward expansion. Barkin stuff. Much like the many phrases inspired by the prairie, the word bark was another staple of frontier slang, often woven into new expressions that reflected life in the Old West. It appeared in a variety of contexts, each revealing something about the language and lifestyle of the time. One of its more unsettling uses was the phrase "to bark someone," which referred to the act of taking a scalp. During the 19th century, travelers moving across the Great Plains were aware of the risks involved in entering territories where tensions between indigenous groups and settlers were high. This term reflected the reality of those conflicts and how deeply such events shaped frontier vocabulary. Beyond that, bark appeared in more lighthearted idioms as well. The saying, "barkin' at a knot," described a situation where someone was wasting effort, either by attempting the impossible or by talking endlessly without accomplishing anything. It was a colorful way of calling out futile actions or meaningless chatter. Another creative expression was barking irons, a term for pistols. The phrase likely came from the loud, sharp sound they produced when fired. For settlers and travelers venturing into uncertain territory, carrying their barking irons offered a sense of security on the open plains. These uses of bark show how frontier language evolved from real experiences, some born out of hardship and conflict, others shaped by everyday life and humor. Together, they paint a vivid picture of how language adapted to the challenges and character of the American West. Toad strangler. Have you ever seen a sudden heavy rainstorm roll in out of nowhere? The kind that drenches everything in minutes and then disappears just as quickly? On the American frontier, there was a colorful term for that: toad strangler. Sometimes called a toad choker or by other similar names, it described those brief but intense downpours that soak the land in a flash. The term paints a vivid image: rain so heavy it could overwhelm even the smallest creatures, and it perfectly captured the dramatic nature of these storms. They were common across the vast plains and prairies of the Old West, where the weather could shift from calm to chaotic in moments. The phrase didn't actually originate on the frontier, though. Its roots trace back to the American South, where it was widely used in states like Arkansas and Louisiana to describe sudden, torrential rains. By the late 1800s, as settlers from the South moved westward, they brought the expression with them. Soon pioneers in Texas, Oklahoma, and beyond were using toad strangler as part of their everyday language. A lighthearted, imaginative way to talk about the unpredictable storms that swept across the wide, open landscapes they called home. Guttersnipe. In the mid to late 19th century, the slang term guttersnipe emerged to describe one of the most visible and heartbreaking social realities of the time: children living on the streets. These were often orphans or runaways with no family support, forced to survive however they could in rapidly growing cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. They sought shelter in doorways, under shop awnings, and even in the gutters themselves, scavenging for scraps of food, discarded newspapers, or anything they might sell for a few cents. Urban society had a variety of names for these children. The most common was street urchin, a term widely used in newspapers and literature of the period. In a more ironic twist, some observers, especially in the financial districts of cities, referred to them as street corner brokers. It was a darkly humorous way of highlighting how these children traded in whatever goods they could find in the refuse of the streets. These young people were often viewed with suspicion and fear by polite society. To many, they represented disorder, poverty, and the darker side of urbanization. Yet behind the dismissive labels was a deeper truth. These children were casualties of industrial growth, immigration waves, and social inequality, struggling to survive in a world that had little space for them. As settlers moved westward during the latter half of the 1800s, the language of the cities, including the term guttersnipe, traveled with them. While frontier towns and mining camps were far less urbanized, the phenomenon of displaced and impoverished individuals wandering from settlement to settlement was still present. Many of these people, though not always children, lived on the edges of society, doing odd jobs, collecting discarded items, or relying on the generosity of strangers to get by. Although guttersnipe was more common in eastern cities, it gradually became part of the broader American vocabulary, symbolizing anyone who lived on the society's margins: poor, homeless, and largely invisible. The word remains a vivid reminder of a difficult chapter in American social history, revealing how poverty, industrial expansion, and westward migration shaped the language and the lived experiences of the 19th century. Words for whiskey. One thing that defined daily life in the Old West, perhaps more than anything else, was the culture surrounding alcohol. On the frontier, the saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was a vital social hub where people gathered to share news, gamble, conduct business, and momentarily escape the harsh realities of frontier life. With few forms of entertainment available, drinking became a ritual woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Because whiskey was such a central part of that culture, it's no surprise that countless slang terms sprang up to describe it. Westerners love to give their drinks colorful names, each one reflecting a certain humor, reputation, or quality. Whiskey might be called dust cutter, a nod to its ability to wash away the dryness of a long ride, or disturbance promoter, a tongue-in-cheek reference to the lively behavior that often followed a few drinks. Other nicknames included scamper juice and bug juice, both playful phrases highlighting whiskey's strong kick. A well-known Irish brand was simply referred to as number 9. Frontier drinkers also had words to describe specific types or qualities of whiskey. Red-eye was the term for cheap, harsh liquor that burned on the way down, a staple of rough saloons and trail towns. Old McBrayer referred to a Kentucky sour mash whiskey with a distinctly bitter edge, while Rock and Rye was a sweeter, bottled blend made from rye whiskey, rock candy, and occasionally bits of fruit, offering a rare treat on the frontier. Perhaps the most famous term of all was 40 rod. A rod is 16.5 feet, so 40 rods equals about 660 feet, or roughly 1/8 of a mile. The name spoke to the whiskey's formidable strength. It was said that a drinker could either muster the courage and energy to walk that entire distance after downing a glass, or be unable to make it even a few steps. Either way, 40 Rod earned its reputation as a powerful and inexpensive spirit. The sheer variety of slang reveals just how deeply whiskey was woven into frontier society. It wasn't merely a drink. It was part of the language, culture, and identity of the Old West. Every nickname told a story about how people related to alcohol. As a comfort on lonely nights, a social lubricant in dusty saloons, and sometimes a symbol of the rugged, untamed spirit that defined life on the American frontier. The Old West wasn't just about dusty trails, saloon doors, and cattle drives. It was a world with its own colorful language, bursting with creativity, humor, and character. These slang terms remind us that even in the toughest of times, people still found ways to laugh, tease, and express themselves in unforgettable ways. So the next time you hear someone acting highfalutin or complain about things going cattywampus, remember, you're speaking the language of pioneers, cowboys, and dreamers who built the American frontier.
Please like and share if you find the video content interesting and useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below so as not to miss the upcoming interesting videos. Thanks for watching.